I spent 40 years pulling people back from the brink of death in a Chicago emergency room. Blood, sweat, and tears were my daily bread. But absolutely nothing could have prepared me for the morning. My only child vanished off the face of the earth. I was sick with a kind of grief that hollows out your bones and leaves you gasping for air. Then my phone lit up with a secure bank alert. $5 million had been wired directly from his private account into my retirement fund. The memo attached to the transfer simply read, "For my heart trust, no one." Less than 24 hours later, his greedy wife was banging on my front door with her high-priced attorneys, demanding I hand over the fortune immediately. She stood on my porch, smiling that icy, entitled smile, like she had already won the war. What that girl did not know was that I was holding a federal police report that was about to rip her entire world to shreds. My name is Loretta. I am 62 years old. I worked double shifts, holidays and weekends, just to make sure my boy Jamal had everything he needed to survive in this harsh world. We ate instant soup and discount bread, so I could send him to advanced coding camps when he was just a teenager. My boy grew up to be a brilliant software developer. He became a self-made tech millionaire who never forgot where he came from or the mother who broke her back to get him there. But success always attracts vultures. Jamal married Sarah, a white woman from a family of old money and extremely cold hearts. I never trusted her or her cutthroat corporate lawyer brother Bradley. I kept my mouth shut and smiled through the disrespect, because my son loved her. I should have listened to my gut. Just 2 days after Jamal stopped answering his phone, 2 days of me pacing the hardwood floors and begging the Lord for his safety, there she was. Sarah marched up my walkway without a single tear in her eye. She did not come to my house to comfort a terrified mother. She came looking for a payout. Her brother Bradley was right beside her, slapping a thick stack of legal documents onto my kitchen table before I could even offer them a seat. I remember the days when my bones ached so deeply I thought they might actually shatter. Raising a young black boy alone in the south side of Chicago is not a task for the faint of heart. It is a daily war waged with fierce love and absolute sheer willpower. I worked back-to-back double shifts at the hospital, wiping down trauma rooms and holding the hands of terrified strangers, just to make sure my own blood had a fighting chance at a real future. While the other nurses went down to the cafeteria for warm meals and hot coffee, I sat alone in the quiet break room, eating instant ramen noodles from a cheap styrofoam cup. Every single dollar I managed to save went straight into a glass jar for Jamal. I paid for his very first computer with money I scraped together by walking 3 miles to work every morning instead of taking the city bus. When he begged to go to those expensive summer coding camps, I took on overnight weekend shifts without complaining once. I shielded my boy from the harsh realities of the streets, wrapping him in a protective cocoon of faith, discipline, and hard work. And it paid off beautifully. My boy grew up to be a brilliant software developer. By the time he was 30 years old, he had built a groundbreaking tech company from the ground up and become a self-made millionaire. But all that money never changed his beautiful spirit. He remained the same respectful, grounded man I raised, always making sure his mother was taken care of and honored. Then came Sarah. Jamal met her at a high-profile charity gala and was instantly blinded by her polished charm. Sarah came from a wealthy, entitled family. They were legacy people, the kind who had their names engraved on hospital wings and prestigious university libraries. From the very first moment she stepped her designer shoes into my modest but pristine suburban home, I could see the heavy judgment swimming in her pale blue eyes. She wore a constant, tight smile that never quite reached her eyes, treating my cozy living room like it was some fascinating museum exhibit of the lower middle class. And she did not come alone. She brought her brother Bradley into our lives. Bradley was a cutthroat corporate lawyer who wore custom-tailored suits and an air of absolute toxic superiority. He looked at my son not as an equal, but as a highly profitable anomaly. To them, Jamal was just a useful asset, a brilliant mind they could attach their prestigious family name to while secretly looking down on where he came from. The disrespect was never loud or violently obvious. It was always wrapped in polite conversation and cruel backhanded compliments. I will never forget our first Thanksgiving together. I had spent 2 solid days preparing a massive feast, roasting a beautiful turkey, baking my famous macaroni and cheese, and making sure every corner of my home felt warm and welcoming. Sarah sat at my dining table, picking at the food with her fork, as if she were afraid the meal might somehow contaminate her. She looked around my living room and told me it was so quaint and rustic that it almost felt charmingly vintage. It took everything in my power not to show how sharply her entitled words stung my pride. But Bradley was significantly worse. He leaned back in my late husband's old favourite armchair, swirling his expensive wineglass, and had the absolute audacity to talk about my son's success as if it were a winning lottery ticket. He looked directly at Jamal and told him how incredibly lucky he was to have stumbled into the tech boom at exactly the right time. Lucky. He completely dismissed the endless sleepless nights, the thousands of hours of writing lines of code, the raw intellect, and the sheer relentless determination that my son poured into building his company. Bradley refused to acknowledge the actual brilliance of a self-made black man, choosing instead to attribute it all to mere chance. I sat there, gripping my cloth napkin under the table, smiling brightly through the immense pain. I swallowed my pride and endured every single condescending remark, because Jamal looked at Sarah with pure, untainted love in his eyes. I did not want to be the bitter mother who ruined his newfound happiness. But my spirit knew better. A mother's deep intuition never lies to her. I watched the way Sarah and Bradley whispered in quiet corners, the way their cold eyes tracked my son's every move. My soul warned me loud and clear that these people were not family. They were greedy vultures circling overhead, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike and pick my boy clean. It started on a Tuesday morning. Jamal always called me on Tuesdays during his morning commute to the downtown tech district. It was our routine, a sacred little pocket of time where he was not a high-powered software executive, and I was not a retired nurse. He was just my boy, and I was just his mama. We would talk about the weather, his upcoming projects, and my garden. But that Tuesday, the phone did not ring. I called him at noon, and it went straight to his voicemail. I called him at dinner time. And again. The cold, automated voice answered. By Wednesday morning, that familiar knot of dread began to tighten heavily in my stomach. Working 4 decades in the emergency trauma room teaches you a lot about the fragility of the human body, but it teaches you even more about intuition. You learn to read the invisible signs of a catastrophe before the monitors even start beeping. My maternal monitors were screaming loudly. Jamal never went dark, not ever. By Thursday afternoon, I was pacing the length of my living room, wearing grooves into the hardwood floor. My phone was clutched in my hand so tightly my knuckles ached with the strain. I was grabbing my keys, completely ready to drive downtown and storm right past the security guards at his office building when the screen finally lit up. It was Sarah's name flashing across the display. I answered on the first ring, my heart lodged firmly in my throat. Sarah was sobbing, or at least she was doing a highly convincing theatrical impression of it. She told me Jamal was gone. She said she woke up that morning and his side of the bed was completely empty. His car missing from the driveway. Her voice trembled and cracked as she spun a frantic story about how he had been breaking under the immense pressure of running his company. She claimed he had been pacing the floors late at night, muttering nonsensically about investors' board meetings and impossible deadlines. She told me he had simply snapped under the weight of it all and run away to escape the work stress. She cried loudly into the receiver, saying she was terrified and absolutely did not know what to do. I sat down heavily in my armchair, listening to the sharp, ragged breaths of this wealthy, privileged woman, and a strange, freezing calm washed over my entire body. I knew my son better than anyone on this earth. I raised a black man in the south side of Chicago to be unbreakable. Jamal did not run from stress. He ate pressure for breakfast. When he was building his software company in our tiny, drafty basement functioning on 3 hours of sleep and cheap instant noodles, he never once folded. The idea that my son would abandon his life's work, his wife and his mother because he was feeling stressed out, was the most insulting, ridiculous lie I had ever heard in my 62 years of life. I offered Sarah some brief, calming words, playing the role of the worried, naive mother-in-law, and hung up the phone. The silence in my house felt completely suffocating. For the next few hours, I was paralyzed with a fear so deep, it felt like frozen lead pumping through my veins. My boy was missing. In this country, when a successful black man goes missing under mysterious circumstances, the authorities do not always rush to tear the city apart, looking for him. Sarah had the unlimited money and the powerful family connections to mobilize the entire police force, yet she was sitting at home, crying about work stress. My mind raced with the most terrifying, grim possibilities. I was moments away from marching to the police precinct myself to demand they file a missing persons report when my phone buzzed violently on the coffee table. It was not a text message from a friend. It was a high-priority security alert from my banking application, followed immediately by an encrypted email notification. I picked up the phone, my hands shaking so uncontrollably I could barely unlock the screen. I opened the banking app, fully expecting to see a standard deposit error or a routine security update. Instead, I found myself staring at a number so massively large, my brain could not immediately process the digits. The screen displayed a pending cleared wire transfer directly into my private retirement account. There was a 5, followed by 6 solid zeros, $5 million. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, entirely convinced the crushing grief and severe exhaustion were making me hallucinate. But the numbers did not change or vanish. The money was real. I scrolled down to the transaction details, my breath catching painfully in my chest. There, in the small, sterile font of the banking memo section, were 6 words that completely altered my reality. For my heart, trust no one. I dropped the phone onto the sofa cushion. For my heart. That was what Jamal had called me since he was a little boy learning to read. I was his heart, and he was mine. The absolute paralysis that had gripped me for 2 agonizing days evaporated in an instant. My son had not run away from a stressful corporate workload. He had forcefully transferred $5 million of liquid cash into my name, completely bypassing his wife, and told me to trust absolutely no one. Jamal was not having a mental breakdown. Jamal was running for his life. The very next morning, the neighborhood mail carrier dropped a stack of envelopes through the brass slot on my front door. Among the mundane utility bills and colorful grocery store flyers was a nondescript, heavily padded brown mailer. There was no return address, printed on the label, just my name, written in thick black marker in block letters. I recognized the sharp angles of the handwriting immediately. I tore the package open right there in the narrow hallway. Inside, wrapped in a layer of bubble wrap, was a single silver flash drive. My hands were perfectly steady now. The blinding panic had been entirely replaced by a clinical, razor-sharp focus. I walked purposefully into my home office, booted up my old desktop laptop, and plugged the silver drive into the port. A single video file popped up on the screen, resting right alongside a heavily encrypted folder simply labeled Evidence. I clicked the video file. Jamal's face immediately filled the screen. He looked exhausted, the dark, heavy circles under his eyes standing out starkly against his brown skin. But his voice was remarkably calm and steady. He looked directly into the camera lens and said, "Mama, if you are watching this, it means I had to go dark. Do not go to the police yet. Just listen to me carefully." What my son laid out over the next 10 minutes was a criminal conspiracy, so vile and treacherous it made my blood boil hot enough to scorch my own veins. Sarah and her arrogant corporate lawyer brother Bradley had been orchestrating a massive, highly sophisticated embezzlement scheme right under Jamal's nose for the past 8 months. Bradley had weaponized his elite legal credentials and his authorized access to the company's financial infrastructure to set up untraceable ghost accounts. Sarah, leveraging her intimate privilege as Jamal's wife, had secretly installed sophisticated keyloggers on his personal laptop at home to steal his master administrative passwords. Together, this brother and sister duo from their legacy, high society family had been systematically siphoning millions of dollars from the company investors directly into offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. But they were not just stealing money to line their own wealthy pockets. They were meticulously planting a digital paper trail to frame my son. They were funneling the stolen corporate funds through dummy corporations, specifically registered under Jamal's name and social security number. Jamal explained that Bradley had manipulated the corporate tax filings with surgical precision. If the federal authorities caught wind of the missing funds, every single piece of fabricated evidence would point directly to the self-made black CEO. They were actively setting Jamal up to take the absolute maximum fall for federal corporate fraud. They knew exactly how the American justice system would treat a wealthy black man accused of stealing millions from rich, powerful investors. They were going to let my boy rot in a federal penitentiary for decades, while they walked away with the stolen millions, keeping their pristine white societal reputations completely intact and playing the role of the betrayed family. Jamal had accidentally caught a tiny discrepancy in the code just days before his disappearance. When he dug deeper into the server architecture, he uncovered the entire sickening plot. He knew Bradley had influential judges and politicians in his pocket. If Jamal stayed in Chicago and tried to fight the false accusations, with just his word against Bradley's perfectly forged legal documents, he would lose everything, including his freedom. So my brilliant boy did what he does best. He wrote a ghost countercode. He managed to quietly liquidate $5 million of his clean, untouched personal equity, securing it where Sarah and Bradley could never legally touch it, safely tucked away in his mother's retirement account. Then he told me his final plan. He had to go completely off the grid to track down the absolute final piece of the puzzle. He needed to secure the raw IP logs from the offshore servers to prove unequivocally that Bradley and Sarah executed the financial transfers from their own private devices. He needed time to hunt down the undeniable digital proof, and he desperately needed me to hold the line at home. He warned me that Sarah and Bradley would realize the $5 million was missing from his personal accounts very soon. He told me they would come for me with everything they had. The video ended abruptly, leaving me sitting in the quiet hum of my home office. I closed the laptop, slowly staring at my own reflection in the dark, glossy screen. The grief and terror of the past 3 days vanished, completely replaced instantly by a cold, deeply calculated clarity. I had spent 40 years in busy emergency rooms, standing firmly between death and the people I was assigned to protect. I had forcefully stopped heavy hemorrhages, resuscitated failing hearts, and commanded chaotic trauma bays with absolute, unwavering authority. Sarah and Bradley thought they were dealing with a naive working-class woman they could easily intimidate and discard. They falsely thought their inherited money and their legacy gave them the inherent right to destroy the beautiful life of the boy I built from the ground up. I stood up from my desk, squaring my shoulders, feeling the righteous, burning anger settle deep into my bones like iron. My son was out there in the dark, fighting a dangerous war to reclaim his life, his company, and his freedom. He trusted me to protect the only clean assets he had left to his name. He trusted me to be his shield. I walked out of the office and into the kitchen, poured myself a steaming cup of black coffee, and began to formulate my counterattack. Sarah and her snake of a brother were going to come knocking on my front door, expecting an easy, frightened target. I was going to give them the absolute fight of their miserable lives. I watched through the sheer curtains of my living room window as a sleek, black, luxury sport utility vehicle pulled aggressively into my driveway. The heavy tires crunched loudly over the gravel, a sound that felt entirely too violent for a quiet suburban morning. The heavy doors opened, and out stepped Sarah alongside her brother Bradley. There were no dark sunglasses to hide weeping, mournful eyes. There were no crumpled tissues clutched in trembling hands. They did not walk up my paved front path like a grieving wife and a supportive brother-in-law seeking comfort. They marched toward my front door like corporate predators, closing in on a deeply wounded animal. Bradley was carrying a thick leather briefcase, his posture stiff with that arrogant, toxic entitlement he always wore like a badge of honor. Sarah walked right beside him, her expensive designer coat pulled tight. Her face set in a cold, hard, calculating mask. I took a very deep, steadying breath, letting the iron resolve settle deep into my bones. And I opened the front door before they even had the chance to knock on the wood. They pushed right past me without a single word of greeting. Sarah did not offer a hug or a comforting touch to the mother of her missing husband. She walked straight into my kitchen, her high heels clicking sharply against the tile floor, and crossed her arms tightly over her chest. Bradley followed right behind her, dropping his heavy briefcase directly onto the center of my polished dining table. The loud thud echoed sharply in the quiet house. He popped the brass latches, pulled out a massive stack of dense legal documents, and slapped them down onto the wood. He looked at me with a gaze so devoid of basic human decency. It actually made my stomach turn. He did not address me respectfully. He spoke to me as if I were a common street criminal standing trial in a courtroom. He told me with absolute certainty that my son was a thief. He claimed Jamal had systematically embezzled millions of dollars from the tech company, and that the $5 million currently sitting in my retirement account was actually stolen directly from Sarah's pristine family trust fund. I stood completely still, letting his venomous lying words wash over me. Bradley paced around my kitchen. His chest puffed out, listing all the incredibly detailed ways he was going to completely destroy my son's legacy and freedom. He told me they had irrefutable digital proof of Jamal's corporate fraud. He leaned over the table, tapping a manicured finger aggressively against the stack of papers, and told me I had exactly one choice. I could sign the transfer authorization forms right there and return the $5 million to his holding account. Count or he would make absolutely sure I went down right alongside Jamal. He threatened me with absolute total destruction. He said if I refused to sign the documents immediately, he would personally ensure I was indicted by the federal government as a co-conspirator to massive wire fraud. He painted a vivid, terrifying picture of heavily armed federal agents raiding my home, dragging me out into the street in handcuffs in front of all my neighbors, and completely seizing the nursing pension I had worked 40 years to build. When I remained perfectly silent, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their wickedness, Bradley took a sharp step closer, aggressively invading my personal space. His voice dropped to a sinister, mocking whisper. He said if the threat of federal prison did not move me, he had a much simpler and much quieter solution. He threatened to go straight to a judge and have me legally declared mentally unfit to manage my own finances. He claimed he could easily convince a court that the severe trauma of losing my son had triggered a massive psychological break. He said no judge in this country would ever believe a retired working-class black nurse over a highly respected wealthy corporate attorney and a grieving, upper-class white wife. He told me he would lock me away in a psychiatric facility, permanently strip me of my human rights, and simply take the money anyway. Sarah finally dropped the grieving wife act entirely. She let out a dry, nasty laugh and stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her ruthless brother. She looked me up and down, a cruel, vicious smirk twisting her delicate face. She told me I was nothing but a foolish old woman who was completely out of her depth. She said Jamal was just a lucky street kid who managed to fool the corporate world, and now his luck had officially run out. She looked around my modest, spotless kitchen, her upper lip curling in deep disgust, and told me I should be incredibly grateful they were giving me a chance to walk away without a lengthy prison sentence. She demanded I sign the papers right now, promising that if I cooperated and kept my mouth shut, they might generously let me keep my little suburban house. The sheer audacity of this woman standing in the home. My hard work paid for threatening to destroy the beautiful son I raised was almost blinding. My hands twitched heavily with the primal maternal urge to grab her by the collar and throw her out onto the concrete street. But my 40 years working in the emergency trauma ward had taught me something far more valuable than physical retaliation. When a patient is bleeding out on the operating table, panic always means death. You do not scream. You do not lash out. You slow your heart rate, you assess the massive damage, and you execute the life-saving procedure with absolute ice-cold precision. I looked at the two arrogant predators standing in my kitchen, and I initiated a mental code blue. I let the righteous, burning anger dissolve completely into the background, calling upon every single ounce of restraint and discipline I possessed. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward physically, making myself look much smaller and far frailer than I actually was. I let my hands begin to tremble violently, knocking them clumsily against the edge of the wooden dining table. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, letting the genuine fear I had felt for my son morph entirely into a brilliant Oscar-worthy theatrical performance. I looked up at Bradley with wide, terrified eyes, letting tears pool rapidly and spill over my cheeks. I begged them both not to call the police. I sobbed loudly, clutching my chest, crying that I was just a tired, retired nurse who did not understand anything at all about corporate funds, wire transfers, or complicated offshore accounts. I wailed that I did not want to spend my final years rotting away in a cold federal jail cell. I told them Jamal had always handled my financial matters, and that I was completely overwhelmed and confused by the sudden massive bank transfer. I played the exact stereotype they expected to see. I became the ignorant, intimidated, helpless elderly woman who was thoroughly terrified by their massive wealth and aggressive legal threats. I clasped my shaking hands together and promised them I would do absolutely whatever they wanted, as long as they promised to leave me out of the federal investigation. Sarah exchanged a triumphant, sickeningly smug look with her brother. She rolled her eyes, clearly disgusted by my display of weakness, and told Bradley to just get it over with so they could leave. Bradley smiled a cruel, highly satisfied grin and told me that signing the papers in my kitchen would simply not be enough. The bank would require my physical presence and my direct verbal authorization to release a $5 million wire transfer of that magnitude. I nodded frantically, wiping my wet face with the back of my trembling hand. I promised to meet them at the main branch of my bank at exactly 9 o'clock the very next morning to authorize the complete transfer of the funds back into their private trust account. Bradley packed his documents back into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass latches shut with an air of absolute finality. Sarah did not even bother to say goodbye. They turned and walked straight out of my house, leaving the front door wide open behind them, fully believing they had effortlessly crushed a foolish, weak-old woman. I stood completely frozen in the middle of my kitchen, listening to the heavy engine of their luxury sport utility vehicle start up and back, aggressively out of my driveway. I waited until the sound of their tires completely faded down the street and silence returned to my property. The very second the house fell quiet, the trembling in my hands stopped completely. The fake tears dried up instantly. My spine snapped straight, pulling my posture back to its full commanding height. The helpless, confused old woman evaporated into thin air, leaving only a fiercely protective mother, firmly preparing for war. I walked over to the heavy oak front door, pushed it shut, and locked the deadbolt tightly. I marched directly into my home office and picked up the telephone. I did not waste a single second. I made my first call to my own legal counsel, the most ruthless, high-powered financial defense attorney in the state of Illinois. He was a man who owed my late husband a massive favor from decades ago, a man who specialized in legally destroying corrupt corporate lawyers, exactly like Bradley. I outlined the situation in quick, concise sentences, demanding his presence at my bank the following morning. He agreed immediately, fully understanding the gravity of the impending confrontation. Then I made the most important phone call of my entire life. I bypassed local law enforcement entirely and dialed the direct line to the Federal Cybercrimes Division. When the federal agent answered the phone, my voice was as steady and hard as a solid rock. I identified myself, provided my social security number, and told the agent I was currently in possession of undeniable, encrypted digital evidence proving a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scheme. I explained clearly that the true perpetrators were planning to meet me at a local bank branch the very next morning to illegally extort $5 million from my personal retirement account. I spent the next 2 hours securely transmitting the exact contents of Jamal's flash drive directly to their secure federal servers. I handed over the hidden ghost accounts, the malicious keylogger source code, the manipulated corporate tax filings, and the offshore routing numbers Sarah and Bradley had so arrogantly used. I laid out the heavy steel trap with absolute surgical precision, ensuring there was absolutely no legal escape route for either of them. They wanted to treat me like weak prey. But tomorrow morning, they were going to learn exactly what happens when you corner a lioness in her own den. I walked into the downtown branch of my bank at exactly 8:45 the next morning. The air inside the private wealth management suite was perfectly chilled and smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. Sarah and Bradley were already sitting at the massive mahogany conference table waiting for me. Bradley looked like a hungry predator who had just successfully cornered his meal. I was wearing a custom-tailored grey suit, and his pale eyes were gleaming with unfiltered greed. Sarah sat next to him with her long legs crossed. I could hear the rapid rhythmic tapping of her designer heels against the immaculate marble floor. She was vibrating with arrogance and impatience, practically salivating at the thought of walking out of that room a multimillionaire. I took my seat slowly, playing the role of the defeated, exhausted mother one last time. Bradley did not even offer a fake pleasantry to keep up appearances. He immediately slid a thick stack of wire transfer authorization forms across the polished wood, along with a heavy gold pen. He pointed a manicured finger to the bottom line, telling me to sign exactly where he indicated so we could put this ugly misunderstanding behind us. He promised that once the $5 million was securely routed back into their offshore trust, they would officially drop the corporate fraud charges against my son. Sarah offered a sickeningly sweet smile, telling me I was doing the right thing for my family and that Jamal would understand eventually. I picked up the heavy gold pen. I let the metal tip hover over the crisp white paper for a long, silent moment. I watched Bradley lean forward in his leather chair, his breathing actually shallow with anticipation. I watched Sarah finally stop tapping her heel, waiting eagerly for the blue ink to hit the page. Then I slowly placed the pen down on the table. I folded my hands together, looked Sarah dead in her cold blue eyes, and smiled a genuine smile. I told you I spent 40 years in the emergency room. I know exactly how to stop a hemorrhage. Sarah frowned, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drawing together in sudden, deep confusion. Bradley opened his mouth to bark another aggressive legal threat. But before he could even form the words, the heavy frosted glass doors of the private suite suddenly swung wide open. It was not the bank manager bringing us fresh coffee. Two federal agents from the cybercrimes division walked into the room wearing dark suits and stern, unyielding expressions. Right behind them was my high-powered financial attorney, looking like a judge, ready to deliver a death sentence. The color completely drained from Sarah's face, leaving her looking like a ghost. Bradley jumped out of his chair, demanding to know what was going on and threatening to sue the entire bank for violating their privacy. I calmly reached into my purse, pulled out the official federal police report and the freshly signed subpoena, and slid them straight across the mahogany table so they could read the charges themselves. The lead agent announced in a booming voice that Sarah and Bradley were under arrest for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and federal conspiracy. As the agents pulled out their handcuffs, Sarah completely lost her mind. That cold, elegant mask she wore for years shattered into a million jagged pieces. She screamed and thrashed as the cold steel clicked tightly around her wrists, crying that her family would destroy everyone in the room. Bradley tried to invoke his right to counsel, but the agents simply read him his rights and pushed him out the door. I sat there in the quiet room, feeling the heavy weight of the last few days lift entirely off my shoulders. The bleeding had officially stopped. The fallout from that morning was absolutely spectacular and completely unforgiving. With the federal subpoena, heavily backed by the data I provided, the authorities raided Bradley's upscale law firm and Sarah's luxury townhouse before noon that very same day. They seized every single server, every hidden laptop, and every offshore bank account routing number the two of them had desperately tried to conceal. Because I had given the cybercrimes division the exact encrypted evidence from Jamal's flash drive, the federal investigators easily traced the stolen millions directly back to Sarah and Bradley's private devices. It took less than 48 hours for the authorities to completely clear my son's name of any wrongdoing. The malicious ghost accounts and the fabricated tax documents were officially and publicly traced back to Bradley's personal internet protocol address. A week later, my front door opened and my beautiful boy finally walked back into my house. He looked incredibly tired and he had a thick shadow of a beard on his chin, but his brown eyes were bright and full of life. I did not care about the dirt on his clothes or the deep exhaustion in his face. I ran across the living room and threw my arms around his neck, pulling him down into the tightest and warmest hug of my entire life. Jamal held on to me and wept, burying his face in my shoulder, just like he did when he was a little boy, scraping his knee on the Chicago pavement. He thanked me over and over again, telling me that my strength had been his ultimate anchor while he was completely off the grid, hunting down the final pieces of digital evidence to bury his corrupt in-laws. He told me I had saved his life, just as surely as I had saved all those patients in the trauma ward. We sat in the kitchen drinking hot tea and watching the evening news together. The lead story was the spectacular public downfall of a prominent legacy family. Sarah and Bradley were both denied bail because the judge deemed them extreme flight risks due to their offshore connections. The federal prosecutors were aiming for decades in prison for the sheer scale of the corporate fraud and the vile conspiracy to frame an innocent man. They had tried to steal my son's brilliant legacy, and instead they bought themselves a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. Jamal and I celebrated our freedom by doing what we do best. We ordered a massive feast from our favorite local soul food restaurant and laughed until our ribs ached from pure joy. A month later, Jamal stood in the center of my living room and handed me a thick leather portfolio. Inside were the founding legal documents for a brand new non-profit organization. He had used the regained equity from his tech company to establish a charity in my name. It was a fully funded initiative designed to provide state-of-the-art coding camps, advanced computer science resources, and full college scholarships to underprivileged black youth from the south side of Chicago. My son looked at me with tears shining in his eyes and told me he wanted to make sure other young boys and girls had the exact same chance he had, because they deserved to have a fierce motherly love backing their highest dreams. We had faced the darkest storm imaginable, and we had come out on the exact other side, completely unbroken. Never underestimate a mother's love, and never ever mistake a black woman's silence for weakness. They thought I was just an old woman they could easily bully and cast aside. They looked at my modest clothes and quiet demeanor and believed I was completely defenseless. But they foolishly forgot exactly who raised the brilliant man they tried to destroy. You do not survive 40 years in a Chicago emergency room without learning exactly how to handle a bleeding wound and a sudden crisis. I built my son from the ground up with faith and fierce determination, and I was not about to let those greedy vultures tear his beautiful legacy apart. Blood will always be thicker than their dirty money. If you know the absolute unmatched power of a mother's deep intuition, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Let me know down in the comments exactly where you are listening from today and what time it is over there. I truly love seeing just how incredibly far our beautiful sisterhood reaches across this vast world. Until next time, my dear friends, please remember to stay strong, stay sharp, and always fiercely protect your peace.